Motorists are looking forward to a drop in fuel prices this week. It's being predicted that petrol will go down by more than 2 rand a litre, while diesel could decrease by as much as 87 cents. But what impact is this likely to have on consumers? Let's unpack this for you now. Bring in Cosatu's Deputy Parliament Coordinator, Tony Ehrenreich, and the AICD Senior Economist, Dr Dick Forslund, both of them joining us via our video link this morning. Gentlemen, it's great to have you on the program. Thank you so much indeed for making time to speak to us. Dr. Forslund, let me begin with you. There had also been fears that the rand's weakening against the US dollar may actually undo the kind of decrease we're going to see in the petrol price. Do you reckon that's still something we need to worry about?
Yeah, maybe, but it's hard to say. But the price of the petrol in the country, it's basically determined by two factors, and one is the price of crude oil, and one is the price of the rand against the dollar. So if the rand weakens, then that affects the price. But the rand is so volatile and going up and down. It's one of the most volatile currencies in the world. So it's hard to say what will happen, what will be the net effect of that.
Right.
But if the petrol is due to fall by over 2 rand, then it should be really a crash of the rand if that would happen, if it would sort of completely cancel out the decline in petrol price.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's difficult to predict. The rand, a quick Google search, is currently trading at 17.38 to the dollar. How far down would it need to go for us to see a less than 2 rand decrease later on this week?
Well, I haven't calculated that,
Fair enough.
As it was kind of like 150 only 1 week ago, 150 stronger or 120 stronger. It seems now that this will have an effect, but we will see next week and the week after that.
Sure.
It will have an effect of cancel out a part of the decline in the petrol price.
Yeah. Tony, let's bring you into the discussion. For the longest time, we've seen how it was ordinary people, in most instances workers, who've had to carry the burden of increasing, or rather the burden of the high cost of living in this country, which is in part fueled by this petrol price hike, excuse the pun. However, there'd been criticism that whenever the petrol price goes down, it takes a longer time, if ever, for that benefit to trickle down to workers as well. Why do you reckon that's the case?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that the pricing model to determine the adjustments and the increases, that's got to be revisited. Because the question about its legitimacy and its credibility in the society has to be looked at, and it's got to ensure that all of the social players are involved in determining that. Because as Dick said, the global rand-dollar exchange rate affects it, and of course the crude oil prices. So those are slightly beyond our control, but we've got to see the effects of those being objectively applied onto the price of petrol. One of the areas we've got to focus on, because you're absolutely right, that the inflationary effect of rising petrol prices are devastating, especially to poorer communities, because food is the most directly affected by rising fuel prices. And so we've got to do something about the price of fuel. There's many components of the prices that's determined locally, like the general fuel levy as well as the third-party levy that we've got to look at, including issues like the retail and the margins on the sale of the price of fuel. So there's many areas we need to look at, many of them that has guaranteed the profits of petrol stations, that has gone into the third-party levy, and the levels of corruption by some lawyers in the third party has been horrific. And that's all what's behind driving the prices. So the general state of corruption and collusion in South Africa has to be examined because it has an impact on the fuel prices. But we've got to disaggregate all that components of the price and start attending to each one of those to make sure that there are no excesses in there and that the consumers and the knock-on effect to the economy is mitigated as far as is possible.
Yeah. So far, we've seen government responding to calls such as the one that you're making by not scrapping, but at least decreasing the general fuel levy. There's criticism, however, that that's not necessarily the right answer. To what extent do you agree with that?
Well, I think there'll be criticism on every component of that fuel increases because there are vested interests behind it, just like most things in the public debate in South Africa. That's why there's got to be an objective discussion about it. It can't be the fuel retailers deciding what the retail margins are. We've got to look to what extent greater competition's got to be introduced. We know part of the retail levy goes to addressing the wages of petrol attendants, and so that has to be kept in place, and that has to be a key part of the price, because already we've seen that petrol attendants are amongst the lowest paid in South Africa. And that's another structural problem that we have in the South African economy, the huge old apartheid wage gaps that still exist in the economy today, and that government has not effectively moved towards addressing and closing. So there's a number of systemic factors across the country and the economy that's brought us to this point, but we've got to make sure that we revisit all of those areas, look at the components of the prices, the effects and the consequences thereof, and make sure that the global prices have a bearing on our domestic prices, but also that some of the fuels, for example, fuels processed from gas or from coal, that those are not subject to global pricings, and that those should give our economy a domestic advantage, given that we have huge supplies of coal, although we must look at the greenhouse effects of that, but certainly on the pricing, there's a lot of space for us to look at how that can be adjusted.
Yeah. Speaking about structural problems, Dr. Forslund, there had also been conversations earlier this year about different fuel retailers being allowed to determine their own pricing. That was kind of punted as a possible solution to the crisis we're seeing in the increases in prices. To what extent do you reckon that could work?
Well, I think that if you would allow for so-called free competition in this sector, I think it's the larger chains of petrol stations that would benefit from that. And I think you would have a larger degree of monopolization in the industry, because if there would be so-called free competition, the big chains of petrol stations, they would be able to hold out and even lower the prices for 1 or 2 years in order to kick out smaller petrol stations or people who are only owning 1 or 2 or 3 petrol stations, and after that the prices would go up again. So that is kind of like it's a feature of the capitalist system, basically, that if you have competition, then after a while it would lead to fewer and fewer producers or service stations. So I don't believe in that solution. When it comes to the net effect of this, for example, on food prices, we must remember that most of the goods that are transported in the country is transported by means of diesel, and those prices are not destined to fall as much as the petrol prices for cars. So I mean, one has to have a general solution for this that address many issues at the same time. And Tony mentioned climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. I ventured 1 month ago when this was discussed that one should consider to reduce the speed limit everywhere, sort of across the board. And I saw now someone told me, or sort of make me aware of that this proposal has already been floated by the road management traffic corporations in February. So one would reduce that is what we do individually in order to cope with the prices if we have a car. We drive slower, and we have over 14,000 deaths in the traffic every year in South Africa. So one should consider to, so to speak, embrace many trees with one hug here, and maybe reduce the speed limits to 110, 90, 70, 50 kilometers, and sure, you would sort of release the pressure release the grief and sorrow and suffering from over 14,000 fatalities in traffic every year. You would reduce also the import, sort of you reduce consumption and import at this point, South Africa is rather importing sort of a lot of petroleum products, and not oil, because many of the refineries in Durban and other places, they have closed down.
Yeah.
And this is so that the import of petroleum products is destined to increase. I saw now in one report by 3 times more next year.
Sure.
So it would be good also for the trade balance. It would be good for the climate, because that is also what will be reduced the greenhouse gas emissions if you are driving slower. That's one effect. And it will reduce death in traffic.
Sure.
And basically there's many net good effects of such a reform. So
I hear
should
that.
be considered.
Yeah, I hear that. It's such an interesting proposal. But I mean, do you really think it'll work in a country like ours? Perhaps, Tony, you can answer that question. I mean, if people aren't keeping to the 120 speed limit, why would they keep to it if it's at 110? Even if you tell them of these many benefits that Dr. Forslund has spoken about, one of which is that you're likely to save on your fuel.
Well, I think that Dick's absolutely right, that we need a cross-section of measures to address the knock-on effects of the rising prices of liquid fuels in South Africa. So there's a whole range of issues that has been mentioned already. It's the makeup of the fuel price, as that Dick points out, the speeds that we travel on as a society generally, and the effect thereof on accidents, as well as the knock-on effect of the price of fuel on the whole economy, and then some of the makeup of the elements of the fuel prices. So we've got to have a discussion about all of it so that we're able to arrive at a rational rate of cost for fuel in South Africa that's mindful of the various elements of the fuel price, given our domestic situation, but is also mindful of the inflationary effect of fuel price increases on the whole of the economy. So that's an important discussion that has to be had. But the question that I think that consumers must be pressurizing government and the industry on is what is taking so long to engage or start that rational discussion? Because the elements are well known, the knock-on effects and the implications and the consequences of fuel price movements in the economy is well known. So there's a need for that engagement. What is taking us so long to start that discussion so that we arrive at a policy mix in South Africa that achieves and both promotes employment creation as well as the macro indicators in the economy? Because at the moment it seems there's just no urgency with tackling those issues in the economy that has a massive implication. And Dick is absolutely right. The discrepancy between the prices of diesel, the prices of fuel, the fact that 3 of the 5 refineries we have in the country are shut down, the commitments from the global refinery players as to whether they want to reinvest in the South African refineries that they do have, the changing nature of trade in liquid fuels on the African continent, and what the implications of mega refineries elsewhere in Africa. How does that relate to the generation of PV, photovoltaic electricity? So there's a whole range of implications. But the big question is, given its detrimental effect on the economy, why has that review not started and why is it not given effect to? Because it's affecting the lives of consumers on a daily basis, and it's a big driver of the causes of poverty in South Africa. So we need urgency, and we need to break down the elements of the fuel price, and we also need to start dealing with those who've corrupted the prices. And here we can make an example of some of the lawyers who've been ripping off the road accident fund. And so there are many areas in the economy that historically has been defined, but that now needs to be reviewed so that the national interest, the public policy, has a greater consideration than the makeup of the players in the industry, many of whom have shown themselves to be less than honorable.
Fascinating issues that are raised around this petrol price hike, or the drop, as it were. Thanks for helping us ventilate all of them. Dr. Dick Forslund is a senior economist with the AIDC. Also joining us there is Tony Ehrenreich, who's Cosatu's deputy parliament coordinator. To both our guests, once again, thanks very much indeed.